Hi, and welcome to The Existential Coach. In this podcast, I want to ask the question, can we be too subjective? And I wanted to start from this point because there, I think, are quite commonly conversations about what we are as subjects, what we are in terms of our identity, and how we convey our subjectivity through identity, how we interact with others, the rights, be they legal or moral or ethical. Even more fundamentally, the way in which we unfold in terms of our assumptions about what is or isn't a good thing, what is or isn't a bad thing. And all of these are played out within some expression of being a self, being a subject. And from this point of departure, I start to think about the ways in which different subjects come into contact with one another, or intersubjectivity. And within this, there's a variety of dynamics, but what I want to focus on today is just the phenomenon of interacting or colliding with other subjectivities. And I want to ask, in these interactions, be they, positive or negative, do we at some points think we are or someone is being too subjective? Now, an example of this might be someone expressing their needs, their wants, someone expressing their desires in a way that seems to overwhelm the interaction of others with them. So, in this way, their subjective expression can protect them from what may feel like a tsunami of other subjectivities crashing on the shores of their self. And so here we see how subjectivity and subjectivities, or intersubjectiveness, set a series of dynamics in motion that become learned. So these learned interactions in how subjects and our subjectivity interacts with others starts to teach us a lot about what's a safe interaction and what's an unsafe interaction. Now, if we think about this idea of being a subject, interacting with other subjects, and we think about growing up, we think about being in school and expectations that we had, motivations that we had, desires that we had, needs, wishes, and so on that we had, they all can be broadly brought under the umbrella of the way in which we wanted to see ourselves as a subject existing with others. And this is a fundamentally existential question insofar as we are asking, how are we in the world? How are we with ourselves? How are we with others? How do we exist in the state of being, in the state of a kind of process of existing, as opposed to a fixed point or a fixed position of existing? And that fixed point, that pattern that can start to shape a sense of certainty about the way we are in the world, can create a sense of certainty. It can concretize our experience in a way that we feel like we're standing on solid ground. Then if we think about this idea of intersubjectivity and our subjectiveness and somebody else's subjectiveness interacting, and we follow the flow of this, it starts to become more and more, I think, obvious that the idea of certain ground, of having this concretized, stabilized, normalized, whatever word you want to use to describe it, that this, although helpful, is itself a kind of illusion and perhaps a kind of delusion. This is not to say that it's inherently problematic or inherently bad or to in any way associate a value judgment with it. Rather, it is simply to just say aloud that the need to have a sense of certainty does give us a reprieve from this state of uncertainty, which is pretty obvious. We seek some sense of continuity, some sense of familiarity, because we are overwhelmed by the idea of discontinuity and the lack of familiarity. And so we could say that there's a kind of ebb and flow of we are engaged, we are changing, we are transforming, we are a subject interacting, we are a subject in process. And then there are times when we reflect, ponder, collect different aspects of our experience and come to an understanding of what that is. And that's when we posit some notion of what our life means, what a situation is, or what's meant by the situation. We may come to a conclusion that we are doing certain things in our lives for whatever the reasons are, but those reasons are our reasons, and so we feel a sense of groundedness within that certainty that we've created. And from that certainty, we can then move forward. And here's kind of the crux of this podcast. If we're not aware of this need or this part of the process, this stabilizing or grounding period that we experience when we create a sense of stability within our lives, and we start to hold on to that idea, then subjectivity and subjectivities that appear outside or to threaten this can create a sense of anxiety, because whatever is our now normalized view, or our given, if you will, that we are operating in the world in a certain way and this is just right. So we have an applied sense of universality that, yes, there can be differences, or yes, there can be ways in which different people operate, but fundamentally there are these innate kind of laws of the universe or laws of nature, or however you want to call it. And one way of arguing this point for individuals who are talking about, there being certain grand narratives or certain guiding principles or certain organizing manifestos, you could even call them, that are innate to all of us, is to point out that there can be a confounding of the physical and the mental world, which is to say the idea that, somebody might say, it's not there's nothing disputable about the argument that jumping out of a window can kill somebody, right? That the physical result of that act, even though that person is convinced mentally that they can fly, therefore, the argument being they are being effectively too subjective, right? They are lost in what I called earlier, the illusion/delusion of existence. And so the argument here is that subjectivity and intersubjectivity can go too far when it undermines such narratives as, in this case, gravity. So I would say that's a misrepresentation of what it is to be a subject. And it's a misrepresentation because what it is to be a subject is to be a being which expresses subjectively. The goal of a subject being subjective is not to be omnipotent and to control the universe, right? That's a kind of conflation of the grand narrative understanding, you could say the epistemological frame of modernism, imposed upon what postmodernism, broadly speaking, is offering. And just to draw a more, familiar parallel, here we can think of postmodernism as modern day skepticism, right? It's challenging some of those rigid, more fixed ideas of what a self is, what existence is, what morality is. So, like I was saying earlier, these ideas about what I am and how I concretize in some way my existence, and do so in a manner that gives me a sense of certainty, and as I pointed out, that has value. Of course, it's a part of what's necessary. Yet, also, as I pointed out, there can be a point at which that is purely habitual. And so, from this perspective, subjectivity through the lens of postmodernism is challenging the habitual nature of patterns and questioning them, saying that fundamentally those patterns exist in language and the concepts exist within language. Yet, just to draw back to the gravity example, those aren't examples that actually exist in language, right? Even if a person was to say, and then postmodernists is apt to say this, all experience is language. The same principle applies, because when you and I talk about gravity, we can say things like, I feel elevated. I feel like I could float. I feel a sense of excitation that I am unbounded. We can say, I can feel like I have buoyancy. All of these things are reflecting and defying physical laws of gravity. We don't actually have that. But through metaphor, we can start to elicit a deeper, more complex set of experiences and set of hypotheticals, and in a creative, artistic way, explore ourself and our selfness in a manner that is more like a painter with a canvas or a musician with an instrument. So reducing, in this case, the music that a person is playing to the physical nature of the instrument, or the painting that a person does to the chemistry behind the colors, misses that there is an expressive subject, that's what we're talking about. So I just want to point that out, because I think there can be a conflation between, at least in my view, taking a modernist view, saying that because postmodernism doesn't recognize certain innate truths, whatever those quote-unquote innate truths are, therefore postmodernism is morally problematic in whatever way, or epistemologically problematic, which doesn't quite make sense because it's challenging epistemology. But the idea here is, can we be too subjective? So, what are these two dynamics? And in a sense, we could say that on the one hand, we have a need to order things, organize things, have them operate within a set of parameters, or there be a routine or a symmetry to them. Then on the other hand, we want some kind of transformation, some kind of change, progress, development. And in that, we want to see ourselves engaging in this efficacy of transformation. And what this means is we want to see that we're having an impact. And it's this idea of needing and wanting to have an impact that I think is really central to the question of both what is and isn't the structures within our system that we can push against, and also the need to express and transgress or transcend, depending on our environment in a way that effectively demonstrates that we exist, that we can actually have influence, that we can engage in a way that our subjectivity has an effect. I mean, if we just think about times in our life where we both wanted to be heard and we wanted to be valued, in those moments, what was going on, seems to me, was we wanted a form of subjective engagement and affirmation. Taken together, it wasn't that there was a conceptual framework that was right or wrong or good or bad, although we may have framed it within that kind of understanding. Really, what we wanted was a way to be subjective and to be known as being a subject. So the question of, is there such a thing as being, or can we be, too subjective, starts to raise questions about what are we comfortable with in terms of the subjective expression of others? At what point do we feel a sense of danger, a sense of frustration, indignance, rage, whatever it is? And is that not a point to explore? Now, the gravity example earlier could be, two people having an argument or a discussion in a cafe, right? There's nothing really at stake as long as it's not escalated or in some way pushed to, say a physical yelling. Yeah, you don't like gravity? Let's see if this is something you don't like. And the person hits them in the head to test out gravity and says, you fell on the floor. What did that feel like? That is a kind of outlandish example, yet this is the kind of experience that we see in our day-to-day lives when questions of, and at the top of the podcast I was talking about this, questions of identity and subjectivity become interpreted in a way that seem to threaten other subjects. And what this reflects to me is an inability to see the holism of a situation or the holistic dimensions of a situation, instead reverting to, and this is in intersubjective theory, it's called the trailing edge, which is essentially a form of rigid repetition, holding to the status quo, whatever that is. And in doing that, what happens is we lack the capacity to see the other as self. And so one of the functions of seeking to transcend one's ideas of the world, even if it's the idea of gravity, is to try and be inclusive of ideas that for us seem outlandish. But what does outlandish mean? When we think about historically what outlandish meant, we've seen it change, of course, but the idea of equal rights between people of different races has seen outlandish. The idea of equal rights between men and women has seen, and for some very much still seems outlandish. These feel like physical truths. These feel like natural law imperatives. They feel like the structure of gravity. And let's be clear, when we're talking about gravity, we're talking about a theory of something. We're actually not talking about the effects of gravity, right? It's a conceptual framework. And so in exploring and deconstructing our assumptions about gravity or whatever it is, we're exploring and challenging the totems that organize our relationships and limit our subjectivity. Because if we start to think about subjectivity as a mode of expression and that we want to be seen as expressing, then what that can do is it can shift us out of either or thinking. So as an example, if I meet a person let's say I'm at a cafe and this situation happens. So I was in a cafe and this guy was kind of messed up on something. He was talking to the barista. It was fine-ish. I mean, he seemed like he was a little manic because he was on something. But the barista was doing her thing and managing this person. But then he started saying things that seemed a little off. I didn't jump in because, the barista was handling it and doing what she wanted. And then at some point she said, "You're making me feel uncomfortable." So at that point, I walked over and I just got in the guy's face and I didn't say anything. I wasn't aggressive, but I was present. And then he said something to me. I forget what he said. He said something to me, and I really had no idea what to say. And he looked at me and then said, "Okay, I'm leaving. And so in some part of me, and I'm not clear on what this was, in some part of me, there was a shift. And as we were leaving, I felt this big brotherly feeling for some reason. And I said, "Are you a cool guy?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, I'm here to help you out because today," I said, "I know you're a cool guy and I'm here to help you out, but today you're not being a cool guy. So today I'm helping you out because I know you're a cool guy." And this is a kind of silly, simple example, and I'm not exactly sure why I had the switch, but basically I made the other myself and myself the other. By saying he was cool, I wasn't pretending that he wasn't messed up and I wasn't pretending that things couldn't escalate. But what I was doing was saying that I was in some way connected to this person. That his behavior, his response is coming from somewhere else. And another example of this is when I've worked with men who are, bigger men, tattooed, 300 pounds, whatever it is. It's not hard for them to come across as being gruff, let's say. Yet I find if I just see them as a 5-year-old kid with glasses and buck teeth, whatever it is that they're saying shifts. This is kind of the key point here, that can we be too subjective really has to come down to, can we slay our own habits and patterns and move beyond our restricted and held views to see things and explore things that do make us uncomfortable? Can we be subjective enough to disagree, to be uncomfortable, to be shocked, and to realize that that implicit shock is a shock of our own subjectivity? In other words, it is a dimension of who we are. It is reflected in how we try and push away from things, and in being too subjective or being more subjective, we engage in a process of integrating or bringing this back into ourselves. So if we go back to the example of gravity, what that misses is that the experience with the person who is saying that they can fly doesn't acknowledge within ourselves this own mystical quality and the power of metaphor to transform creatively. So just like my little cafe example, I just changed the dynamic by saying, "Are you cool?" To which they responded, "Yes." And I could say, "I know." If a person says, "I can fly away," and I say, "I know you can you write about it? I know you can. I can feel that you can do that because you want to change your life and do things." And they say, "No, I literally want to jump off the roof." Where are you going to go? If you explore it, if you go down the premise, and I've had situations where you start to explore whatever that initial eruption is, the thing that seems so vile, so upsetting, you start to get a sense that, or you realize that when you actually explore it, they don't know what happens after they hit the ground. That's not a part of what they're thinking. They're thinking they're just going to fly. So what does that mean? I'm going to be free. You want to be free? Yeah. Why do you want to be free? And now we're in, again, to the realm of metaphor. So I think I'm trying to point out, and I don't know how well this is coming across, but I'm trying to point out how we can conflate the subjective creative expression of self that can be endlessly unfolding in a creative set of metaphors. Or we can at some point stop and say, well, because it doesn't meet some kind of physical criteria or some universal law, and we know these universal laws to be true, therefore postmodernism or creativity or expression is problematic, misses the point that it's actually a challenge. We have to now try and understand how to see beyond the conception that was previously taken as a given. So for example, givens about gender, givens about race, givens about religion. These are fundamental blocks and challenges to our own subjective, creative, expressive selves. And if we can step beyond those, if we can look past our own discomfort, our own frustration, that of course gravity is real, yet that doesn't matter, right? Telling people gravity is real isn't going to stop suicide. That's not the missing piece here. If we start to think in those terms, we are protecting ourselves while not making the more fundamental connection to the individual who is speaking in language. And language is a form of expression that is transformative, right? If it becomes fixed, it becomes rigid. And that's where we move to the idea of the leading edge. This is what I'll finish on. If the trailing edge is the repeated experiences, and many of those come from traumatic experiences, cultural, social, all of these different things where we learn how to exist as a subject within society. Hope, or the leading edge, is the way in which we start to explore and expand the traps of our own existence, which in one way may have provided a sense of certainty for us, yet at this point is starting to lock us in. So if we find ourselves at a point where, in trying to discuss and explore our own experience, we're pulling upon rigid systems to make our point, my question is, why can't you jump? So, can we be too subjective? Can we be too literal? Can we be too fixed? Can we be too anything? And my sense is, if we explore the dynamics between, modernism, postmodernism, if we start to explore the ideas between leading edge and trailing edge, we may start to get a sense that by exploring these dynamics, we are actually confronted with some kind of fixed notion of identity. But we're also given an opportunity to integrate something that goes beyond what we currently understand and accept to be the way things are. And that is an opportunity to create and to expand. So, until next time, you can find me at jordanoconnor.com. But other than that, bye for now.